The decision between self-publishing and going for a traditional book deal can be a huge decision in the life of an aspiring author, but I find that there is a lot of confusion around the topic. And one of the areas that I find has a lot of misconceptions floating around out there is how long it takes to publish traditionally. And that's why today I want to talk through my own journey of publishing my last book so that you can get a sense of the timeline, including all of the little steps along the way. Stay tuned. If you are fed up with trying to stumble through this writing project with no idea where you're going or when you'll get there, you need a plan. And I have got the tool for you. Right now, you can download the Writing Plan Calculator. It's going to give you a timeline for your whole book project, the goals that you need to hit along the way, and the flexibility to adjust when your schedule changes. You can download it right now at pageandpodium.com/plan. Oftentimes, I find aspiring authors are pretty shocked to hear how long it takes to go from writing a manuscript to holding a traditionally published book in your hands. It takes a long time, and I often suggest that people plan on at least 3 to 5 years or more. But this is a really difficult concept to wrap your head around because there are so many pieces and parts and components that go into the process of moving through the manuscript, getting it into a publisher's hands, and finally holding that book and then promoting it. So today I want to talk through the timeline that I went through on my most recent book. Now this book is co-authored with Dr. Andre E. Johnson. It's called The Summer of 2020, George Floyd and the Resurgence of the Black Lives Matter Movement. And it came out in March of 2024. So now, about a year after the release of that book, I want to share with you the entire project timeline, going all the way through our promotional stages that happened as the book was being released and after. So let's talk about where we are going to start. Then we'll look at kind of the process of getting things settled with the publisher, and then we'll talk a little bit about the promotional aspects. And through all of this, I'm going to give you month markers just so that you can kind of see how long these different processes take. Now, first, a caveat. Y'all know I love a caveat. When I am talking through this timeline, this is only my experience for this one book. Now, I've published 2 other books, and I've worked with many, many authors publishing their books traditionally as well. So I do have a sense that this is a pretty standard timeline. But I also know that your mileage may vary. There are huge differences between publishers, between types of manuscripts, and yet most of the things that happened here at the times they happened were pretty standard. So I think this is going to be a really helpful illustration of how this process is likely to go if you go with a traditional publisher, particularly a smaller press. Okay, so to start out with, as you may have gleaned from the title, we started writing this book in the summer of 2020. As we were putting it together, we were working with this series of interviews that we had conducted. We were talking with activists, everyone from people who had been active in organizing circles for years, all the way through to people that were just kind of dipping their toe in the water of activism, joining protests, attending different kinds of rallies during that summer period. So it took us about a year to put the book together. Now, could we have gone faster? Yes, for sure. But life is gonna life. And in that 1 year period, even though we were actively working on the book, stuff popped up, blocked us along the way. One of us had a death in the family, the other was moving. There's a lot that goes on. And so one of the things that I do want to stress here is that a year is a pretty typical amount of time. Even if you could write your book in 3 or 4 months, most of us are really going to benefit from a longer timeline. Now, I talk about this part of the process all the time, so I'll keep it pretty brief here. But as Andre and I were putting this book together, the main thing that we were looking at was going through the content that we had, the interviews that we had conducted with people, as well as our outside knowledge and our experiences. And then we were grouping it together, as we have our clients do, into an outline. From there, obviously, we're drafting, writing, getting feedback, revising. And that process really took about a year. So in the summer of 2021, that was around the time that we were putting our proposal together, figuring out what we wanted to do with the book. Now, at this point, we did not have a book contract. Sometimes you may, and I suspect we probably could have gotten a contract on just a proposal. But because we knew we needed to write the book anyway, we knew that putting in the work to write the draft first was really going to clarify the way we wanted to pitch it. So in our case, we chose to write the whole draft and then send out the proposal. But at any rate, the main thing was that we needed to brainstorm which presses we thought we wanted to work with. And then, because both of us are more experienced authors, we had some contacts in different publishing houses that we reached out to. If you are a first-time author, and I know many who watch this channel are, you will have a little bit more of a barrier there. Oftentimes, we'll have the querying process that will happen. Effectively, by reaching out to our friends at these publishing houses, we were querying. It's typically a much more formal process though. So when I'm talking with clients about this stage, I always suggest that you get your query and your proposal together. For a nonfiction book, you almost always need both a query letter and a book proposal. And in fact, across the board with our clients, we almost always suggest that people do that, particularly if you are a first-time author. So it's a little bit more difficult to imagine how the book might come together. You would then send your query letter out to agents or editors, depending on the size of press you were going for. You'd need to wait for responses. They would review your proposal, etc. For us, we were able to reach out to the editor that we decided we wanted to work with, and we were able to kind of handshake negotiate how the book would move forward, let her know that we were going to work with them, and once we had everything together, we could send them the manuscript for review. Now, one thing I do want to point out, especially if you are someone that is working on an expert-based book, one thing that we did here is that as we were wrapping up the project, we really knew that we could benefit from some additional support. Since at the time, Andre was a professor, I had just left being a professor at that time, but Andre was a professor still. So we were able to use some of the professional networks in academia to get some grants. And the way that we did that was that we were able to ask our editor for what's called a letter of intent. Now, a letter of intent this is not going to apply to everyone, but if you can get a letter of intent, and if you are dialed into some kind of a national organization, very often there will be grants that are available for book writing. So we were able to actually we got 2 grants that helped us to get some assistance to do some revisions. We were able to have them do some of the citation gathering. We had cited different people. You have to put that all together. And we were able to get a grant to have the index done. That is almost always the author's responsibility, and it's kind of a pain. So we were happy that we were able to use that letter to get those grants. Now, by the time we had our proposal really solid and we felt really good about submitting it to the press, we went ahead and sent it in fall of 2021. So you can see we did have a few more months after we'd finished drafting where we were doing things like revising. As I said, we were getting grants to help support some of the revision process and the polishing stuff. So it was a couple of months there. But then in our case, the press was very quick. And I find this to be pretty common, actually, if a press is interested in your book. Not always, but pretty common. It was only a couple of months later that we received the approval. So that was around the end of 2021 into the beginning of 2022. For the particular press that we were using, it was a nonprofit press, a really, really good fit with our book, and they have an editorial board. This is really common. So the next hurdle that we knew we had to get through was getting our actual manuscript approved by the editorial board. I will tell you, when I published my first book, this step scared me so much. I just wasn't expecting it. So I want to make sure that you have this on your radar. What often will happen is even after you have kind of made this handshake deal with your editor that the book is going to this press, Oftentimes, there is just a final approval clause in your contract that says that you need to have the approval of a full board of editors. So I have never been to an editorial board meeting. Authors are not invited. But what I have heard from my editor friends is that this will be a group of all the editors at the press, and they just go around the table. Each acquisitions editor, that's the person that you are in contact with, will pitch the books that they have on their slate. What they are trying to do is make a case to the other editors that this book is a quality product, that it fits with their existing list of titles, so it's going to make sense for the press's brand, and that the book is saleable. Here is where this book proposal step comes in so handy because, of course, in writing our book proposal, we had made a really strong case that this book was going to sell and that we were going to participate in that sales process. So we knew we had a lot of strong support behind publishing this book, stuff that we had provided to help that editor pitch. But of course, the quality of the project matters very much too. So we had decided, Andre and I between us, that it mattered very much that we took the time we needed to revise. Now, again, we had already revised, but at this point we were going in, digging into some of the comments we'd gotten from our editor. So this process for our full-length book, this took about 8 or 9 months. And it wasn't until fall 2022, so fully 2 years and a little more from the time we started writing, that we were able to submit that final manuscript to the press. Now, that is not a long timeline. Very often I see first-time authors especially from the first time they start writing that book through the time that they have the final manuscript in the press's hands. That can often be much, much, much longer than a 2-year window. But for us, that's about how long it was, and that felt really, really good. We had the space and the time and the ability to really process kind of our own personal things while spending a lot of focus on the book because we went ahead and took that kind of 8 or 9 month period to get that project done. But of course, just getting even that one set of feedback wasn't enough. We sent in our polished manuscript, and the editor wanted a few changes to be made. It wasn't really until January 6th, 2023, that we were able to submit the final manuscript, which was so graciously accepted by the press and moved forward. Around this same time, and in fact, that January date became our deadline, the editorial board was meeting to discuss their slate of releases. So this is something that has to happen. You usually will not just get to pick your release date. Oftentimes, there will be some meeting between marketing. If you have a publicist, they would be involved in this too. The editorial board, various people that are going to meet to decide when each book will be released. Typically, there will be both a seasonal catalog, so both a group of books that are coming out in a particular season, and individual release dates for each of those books. So there's a lot that's going in here. We did not, in our case, have much input. We didn't really need to give much input, but I have also experienced authors getting a lot more kind of consultation, sort of, especially if it is an expert book, kind of thinking about, okay, well, when are people most interested in contacting you about this project and that kind of thing. So this is the point at which I find that most authors sort of don't realize that there's a lot more that you have to do, and it's also just transparently not very fun. But I want to share all of these kind of mini steps that go into what is called the production process. So as you are working with that first editor that is your editor, you will think of them as your editor. That person, as I mentioned earlier, is called an acquisitions editor. They literally acquire books for the press. And that person is typically the most involved with you. But as we move out of this stage where you're working with your acquisition editor and you're getting feedback and you're polishing the manuscript, as we move out of that area into production where there is a physical book is being produced, you will work with many, many other people. And in fact, it's very common that you're just kind of getting different people's name and your email address, and usually they will label the email as coming from the press, but you don't necessarily know all the people you're interacting with here, and it can feel a little bit overwhelming. So for us, that started with some of the technical pieces of the manuscript that needed to be delivered in a particular way. One thing that is very common, in fact, almost always this is the case, is that we needed to break our book into one file per chapter that could then be delivered as a series of many files that were put into a zip folder and sent. Now, your editor can help you with this. They are around, and in fact, the editorial assistant offered to help us with anything we needed help with. This is something I've done before, so it wasn't really challenging. But I have had many cases where the kind of technical stuff gets a little bit overwhelming. At this point, you may be asked to provide things like a high resolution file for every image or chart or graph that you want to include in your book. That is often the responsibility of the author. Not always, but particularly in general nonfiction with a smaller press. I have also had to provide the licensing information when I was working with material from another author or creator where I was in contact with them and I just needed to get a signed form from them. There can be all kinds of things that they will need at this point. But there's really no need to worry. Your editor or their assistant will really walk you through this process just to make sure that you have what you need. And in fact, I will be transparent with my second book. I sent the images over the graphs that I had created as part of the project, and I didn't do it correctly. They had to hop in and say, oh, these aren't good enough. Can you do it X and Y and Z way? And they were very helpful. That has been my experience really in almost every case for myself and for the authors I work with. But be ready for this kind of technical stuff. So that was happening around February, so about a month after we had sent that final polished manuscript. The most exciting thing for every author I've ever known happened in July when we arrived to our email inboxes to find that we had the cover design. Oh my gosh, we love it. I want to talk a little bit about this process because this is one of the areas that I find really surprises first-time authors. When you work with a traditional press, most of the time you will just get your cover design and that's what it is. That isn't to say that they don't care what you think. Oftentimes you will be asked during that kind of little technical period I just talked about that we did in February to fill out some forms. Usually one of them has to do with kind of you and your connections, your local paper, that kind of thing. And the other one will be a design information form. So we'd filled this out and kind of let them know what the vibe of the book was and, the sort of vision that we had. But we got the cover design. I loved it. But I do want you to know it is not sent to authors kind of for feedback. It's typically just sent as a kind of an FYI and so that you can get kind of excited about it. I know of one instance in my entire career where an author worked with a traditional publisher and was able to get the cover design changed from what was originally presented. It is very, very rare. And for good reason. You are working with a professional book cover designer at a major press. They know what they're doing. And I know they know what they're doing more than I do. That is absolutely not my area. So I was really pleased with the book cover, and I always suggest to authors, just find a way to love it because it really kind of is the way it is, whatever the cover comes back as. We loved it. The next month, in August 2023, we heard from the copy editor. I have not always heard from the copy editor in advance, but I actually liked this little touch. The copy editor reached out to us and said that he was about to begin work on the manuscript and said that he was looking forward to it. We thanked him for the update. It took him about 3 weeks. It's pretty standard to get the copy edit back to us. And then around September, we had to reply to the questions that he had asked, some clarifications, some citations that looked off, that kind of thing. So then at that point, the book went into layout design. Now, layout design is something that is going to happen away from you. Typically, the author is not involved in this, but you do need to be ready because the next thing that happens in the process is that you will get your Galley Proofs. All Galley Proofs are, this is just a fancy way of saying the layout in a PDF. And what you are asked to do as an author, usually you have a couple of days, it's a pretty quick turnaround, and you are asked to print out the manuscript and go through and find any places where there are errors, any places where, the cutoff at the bottom of the page kind of looks wonky or an illustration kind of landed on the wrong page, whatever it may be. you have to go through this and then you have to send back the manuscript with your notes. In this case, we were able to do that all electronically, but I will also tell you I've had experiences where I needed to actually mail the Galley Proofs back to the press. Either way, the most important thing is that you are communicating with your press about whether, things have been changed that really are not okay, if there are things that need to be adjusted. You are the last set of eyes on your manuscript. You are the final person that can catch any major errors. So I took this very seriously. I know Andre did too. We combed through the manuscript and sent it back to them. Now at this point, we're pretty well done. We had heard that we had this release date in March, so we were just 6 months or so away. And as the book went up for pre-order on the website, our role changed from working on the production aspect into working on the promotion aspect. I've talked about this before, so if you are not new to this channel, you will have heard me say traditional publishers will not do long-term marketing and promotion for you, and every traditional publisher will expect you to be involved and engaged in the promotion process. So, what we had decided to do for our promotional kind of contribution activity was that we wanted to do a podcast tour. So between Andre and I, we appeared on a lot of different podcasts talking about the book, encouraging people to buy it, but also really focusing on the message. And that's something I really want you to hear, that as we were promoting the book, we were not focused on buy, buy, buy. We were focused on, here is some of the interesting, helpful information that we learned that listeners might be interested in knowing. What happens then is you get more of an organic buying cycle where people who are interested in that information see that they can buy your book and very often then will do that. So for us, that lasted about 6 months. We did a couple of signings, that kind of thing, around March when the book did eventually release. Now, I also want to talk about, though, what we mean by long term. It has now been about a year since that book came out, and Andre and I both are still promoting it. Are we doing a podcast tour? I would not say that, but as recently as October, we were at a conference talking about the book that was aired on C-SPAN pretty recently, and we still are called to give kind of commentary, to give press quotes, that kind of thing. And I suspect that will continue to go on, as my other books have, for some time. So I want you to realize that as we're going through this process, the timeline starts to just become your life. And actually, that is great. Once you get into that writing process, the development, then the chapter train, as you go all through production, you will feel that you are being kind of shepherded through this process. And very often, we don't know where we're headed next. We did not know that we were going to have this C-SPAN offer. We did not know that we were going to have X and Y and Z podcast offers. We didn't necessarily know. But part of the process of writing a book is learning so many things about your topic, but also about yourself, about how you exist and interact in this particular world of publishing. So, my last piece of advice, my last piece of information here is, if you decide to go with a traditional deal, you know now that this is quite a long process that will ask quite a lot out of you. But also, the fact that it's a long process does not mean that it should be more daunting. And in fact, if you don't have a timeline and you have an inkling that it would be better for your book to go traditional, I think you should try it. It doesn't have to be nearly as intimidating or scary as you think it does. So, with that said, I would love to help talk you through what the process of getting your book out there might look like. If I can help, if you have a book that you would love to get some support for, I hope you will reach out and let us know. Page and Podium would love to help you get over that first finish line of writing the book and help you move forward to the publishing process. Happy writing. If you're writing your first book, I bet you already know you need a plan. But the hardest thing about making a plan for your first book is you don't have the experience to know how to plan. And that is why I put together our newest free download, the Writing Plan Calculator. With this calculator, you are easily going to be able to figure out a realistic timeline, realistic weekly goals, and the flexibility you're going to need for this long-term project. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/plan, and you are going to knock this book out of the park. I can't wait to read it.